Shame is an unpleasant emotion we have all experienced at one point or another. It's the feeling associated with knowing that we've done something wrong, that our actions were not aligned with our values. Now, in this way, as my interview guest, Dr. Joe Burgo, argues, shame can be a positive emotion because truly understanding why you feel ashamed can help you to grow to be the person you want to be. Moreover, he argues that shame is better thought of as a whole family of emotions, of unpleasant self conscious emotions, including guilt and simply feeling bad about yourself or who you are. Joe Burgo has been practicing psychotherapy for nearly 40 years, and he currently works via Zoom with clients all over the world. He's also published a half dozen books, fiction and nonfiction, including most recently, Building Self-Esteem: How Learning from Shame Helps Us to Grow, which is what we'll be discussing in this interview. Here I speak with Dr. Burgo about shame from his unique perspective as a therapist. Now, without further ado, I bring you Dr. Joe Burgo. All right, so I'm here with Dr. Joe Burgo. And first off, you wrote the book Shame, Free Yourself, Find Joy, and Build True Self-Esteem, which is what we're going to be talking about mostly today. So can you kind of give the elevator pitch or like a brief summary of the book and why you decided to write it?
Um, Starting with the last question, why I decided to write it is because for me personally, in my personal journey and as well in my practice, shame has become the focus of my work for the past 20 years. I think that shame has kind of gotten a bad name. Um, it's seems to be viewed as this uniformly toxic kind of experience that is imposed on us by other people, by society. That's Brene Brown's perspective, or by really toxic parenting, John Bradshaw's take. I think that shame actually is a normal everyday experience that we need to understand better. That's why I wrote the book, to try and explain what it is, why we feel it, why evolution saw fit to encode it in our genes so that we all have a capacity to feel shame. Um, and then I wanted to show the typical ways that we defend against shame by either denying that we feel it, by trying to blame other people for it, trying to control the experience ourselves. And I link it up to case studies and um, how it comes up in my practice so that other people can see it all around them, I hope. I mean, it's ubiquitous.
Yeah. And on that note, one of the major themes, or I guess kind of a definitional point that you make at the beginning of the book, is the distinction between what you call shame as a family of emotions versus shame in all caps. And maybe you can differentiate between what those two are.
Yeah, I mean, I put shame in all caps. That's kind of the experience that I think Brene Brown and John Bradshaw are talking about. It's the big, scary, toxic thing that nobody wants to feel, right? But shame is in fact a much larger experience than that. It's a family of emotions that comes from um, Bruchek is a psychoanalyst, and that's his idea. It comes out of affect theory, and basically it's a set of emotions where the common experience is kind of a painful awareness of self, and that could be something as small as feeling self-conscious. It could be embarrassment, mild. It could be humiliation, mortification. It can be fleeting. It can be an enduring. It could be big or it could be small. But all these emotions share that kind of painful awareness of self, and that's kind of in contrast to pride, which is a pleasant awareness of self, right?
Right. Yeah, and so it sounds like, and you cite him multiple times in the book, but Michael Lewis, the emotions researcher, seems to be influential in your way of thinking about the self-conscious emotions.
Right. You know, it's one of those experiences where you have a clinical understanding of something. You really know how it works, and then you have to go find what everybody else says about it to find the science behind it. That was that was actually a pretty enjoyable experience. I had to read a lot of things that I probably wouldn't normally read, um, to find out, that there's a whole group of affect theorists who believe that it's inbuilt. We all experience it, and you can see it in the first months of life.
Mm. Yes, yeah, and that definitely the breadth of both the clinical side and the kind of more academic understanding of shame absolutely comes through. Um, so another distinction I thought was interesting, or I guess it was sort of a lack of distinction that you made, was between the difference between guilt and shame, because those are often distinguished, but you sort of blur the boundary between those.
Well, it's the kind of one of those widely accepted definitions that everybody believes without questioning it. I think it's Bradshaw who says guilt is about what you do, shame is about who you are. And I would say yes, that's true, but they're both in that painful awareness of having done something wrong, or the painful awareness of who you are as a person. They're all shame. They're part of the shame family of emotions. So it's a useful distinction, but you know, I don't find it terribly useful, I guess, to be honest.
Gotcha.
But it's
Yeah. Yeah, that definitely makes sense. And just a couple more sort of definitional points before we jump into a little bit of the developmental stuff. One concept that you outline is core shame, and I wonder if you could just outline what that is. What is core shame?
yeah, it's it's an experience, an agonizing experience, often unconscious, of your development having gone really wrong during childhood, that it departed dramatically from what might have been expected, what your genes encode in you as an expectation for what the world, the environment, your family will provide to you, when it's just really, really off. You grow up with this feeling of defect, um, and there's scientific evidence for what I would call brain damage, that if you don't get what you need in those early months and years of development, your brain doesn't develop normally. You can see it in MRI scans. There's differences between the brain scans of healthy children and children who grew up in, extremely toxic environments. It's very painful to see, and to know that it's kind of, um, it's not that it's irreparable, but it's kind of like, the analogy I use is with rickets. Like if you don't get the vitamin D you need, as a vitamin C, I can't remember, but it's a certain vitamin that you need for proper bone development in a critical stage, and if you don't get it, you'll never be the same. You'll never be as if you had that during the critical period. And there's critical periods for emotional, psychological experiences, just like there are for everything else. And if you don't get what you need from your environment, you don't grow up as you might have done in a normal environment. So that's core shame, a sense of inner defect, damage, this knowledge that you're quote different, you're not normal.
Mm. Yeah, and what sorts of things like is it simply positive experiences with between the parent and child at that critical period or during that critical period that um, maybe tips the balance one way or the other? Are there other kinds of experience? I guess what I'm asking is what sorts of experiences are needed for that kind of core shame to develop?
Right. Well, obviously, if there are things like, violent discord in the household, um, physical and sexual abuse. I mean, those are obviously going to damage you. But I spend a lot of time in the book detailing how in the first year of life there needs to be a lot of kind of positive mirroring back. The way parents are infatuated with their children, and they, kind of everything they do is wonderful. Um, Joyful experiences, shared joy experiences, those are necessary for the brain to develop. And then in the second year of life, there's a different kind of experience in which parents start to say things like no, um, and where they introduce what child development experts would call shame. It's where not every, the kid does something that used to get like praise or admiration, and then it gets a no or it gets a correction because the parents are teaching them, how to fit into society, what the world expects of them. And you need both of those. You need the joyful experience of connection and mirroring, and then you need the appropriate non-harsh shaming experiences in which they learned to curtail their grandiosity, I'd say, learn how they fit into the world, learn to have a concept that other people also exist and you have to take them into account. Um, that's it, in a simplified version. And if there's a lack of empathy in the household, if the parents are incapable, if they're drug addicts, if there's violent divorce, I mean, all of those things will interfere with the proper unfolding of development.
Right, right. And I want to return to the using shame to socialize children in just a moment, but um, on this point of development, one thing that you describe and relate to a number of times is the still face experiment. And I'm wondering, how does that relate to these idea of shame experiences in early childhood? Yeah, I guess I'll let you take that. However.
Sure. Well, one of the points I make is that shared in that first year of life, shared joy is really it's it. It's the baby seeing in the parent's face that he or she brings joy to their parents, that it's reflected back to them. And there's all sorts of stuff about the chemistry, the neurotransmitters that are released during this experience. Um, that's that's key, and it's a lot about face, right? Shame is a lot about face. Saving face is the way we talk about shame. So when the parent in the still face, it's a mother. When the mother's face goes blank, when the child was expecting joyful mirroring and engagement, it's traumatizing. And if your listeners haven't seen this, they should go to YouTube and search the still face experiment. There's a number of videos, but um, they're incredibly painful to watch as you see this baby become more and more distressed at the mother's lack of engagement. I think that is a shaming experience when you want to engage and you want to share joy, and instead you're met with indifference or worse. That's a shaming experience. Imagine that repeated over and over and over again in a traumatic environment. A mother who has postpartum depression, or
Mm.
there's violent discord. Then it builds up into this. I think it becomes an unbearably shaming experience, and then you have to develop all sorts of defenses against it to ward it off. But um, yeah, that's why the still face experiment is in the book, because it's all about the face.
Yeah, yeah, it seems to provide this kind of foundation um, for how we experience shame later on. Um, so maybe we can go into a little more detail on the healthy and the unhealthy ways of using shame to socialize children. You mentioned that a little while ago, but maybe you can give some examples or just go into a little more depth.
Yeah, I mean, I think that distinction we were talking about earlier about shame being about who you are. That's the bad kind of shame, and it's where the message to the child is kind of global. Like, it's not, you did something wrong. It's that you're a bad child because you did something wrong, right?
Mm.
It's like it's too big, it's infused with parental anger, and it happens too often. Um, the kind of shame that's useful in parenting is really very subtle. And one of the things that researchers talk about is that often um, breaking eye contact or looking away can communicate a disapproval. That's a very minor kind of shame. So that the child does something that she's really proud of, but it isn't really acceptable to the parent, and the parent kind of just doesn't praise her, doesn't
Mm.
smile, but kind of looks away, that could be shaming. And it's a minor correction, so the child gets the message, oh, that isn't acceptable behavior.
Mm.
And because shame is so painful, even those in those little doses, we all want to avoid it, right? And so by having that experience and having that slightly painful experience of shame, then the child won't do it the next time. I mean, that's the idea, is that they learn, the shame teaches them something about what's acceptable behavior, but in a very micro way, not in a global way.
Right. Okay. Yeah. And a manageable dose and not global, as you say. Um, so now moving into more, I guess, into adulthood or just regular life outside of childhood development. Um, what are some of the most common general causes of shame in our daily lives? I'm thinking of unrequited love and unwanted exposure, some of these themes that you touch on in the book.
These days, I think the biggest one that everybody will relate to is being, exposed in some way to censure that's really painful. I mean, the social media shaming is the big thing that everybody's frightened of. Everybody's afraid of having a wrong opinion and there being a pile on and being cast out. I mean, being outside of the group, being unaccepted is huge. Everybody's afraid of that. I mean, and with good reason. I mean, survival depends upon being accepted into the tribe and belonging, right? So if you're outcast, then it's a life or death issue.
Right, right. Okay. Yeah. Well, that does seem to accord with the sort of cancel culture and then that kind of whole world of things, which I actually want to touch on in a little while. But as far as another part of your book, as you mentioned earlier, has to do with kind of the ways that people hide, deny, or control their shame. So I just want to ask you about a few of those. Um, so first off, I found it interesting when you were mentioning anxiety and specifically social anxiety, and how shame is often related to that. Can you talk a little about that?
I mean, I think it you don't have to be a psychologist to understand that people don't like to be exposed in unflattering ways and are really frightened of being judged or found inferior or unattractive or unlikable. Um, those are all shaming experiences, and you will feel anxious at the prospect of encountering that experience. So, hence social anxiety, right? I think that's pretty much what it's all about. It's all about it's anxiety about feeling shame, the kind of shame that would come from being exposed in an unpleasant way.
Mm, yeah, very clear. Another one that you mentioned was procrastination. How is that? Those seem like somewhat disparate concepts, shame and procrastination. Can you tie those two together?
Yeah, I've belonged to a writers group for the last 25 years, and we talk about this. If you never finish something, you never have to encounter judgment, right? I have a friend who's been working on the same novel for 25 years.
Mm,
And it's brilliant, but it's probably not perfect. Um, it, and I think the perfectionism of wanting to present something to the world that is immune to criticism. I mean, it's immune to any kind of shame. I think that often leads people to just never finish, right? You just never cross the finish line because you can't bear the prospect of criticism.
right, right. Um, all right, now a couple others here, just kind of touching on a lot of the themes that you cover, um, such as addiction and promiscuity. That was a really interesting chapter. So, can shame or does it often encourage addiction and promiscuity? Is it just one of the many causes of these things? Is it always there? How do you view that connection?
I, 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 I can't generalize to say that it's always there, but it's a big part of it. It's drugs and alcohol make shame go away, right? They dissolve into alcohol,
Right.
and becomes a kind of vicious circle where you use drugs to escape from shame and you feel better, but then when you recover from the drug, you feel shame for having used the drug, and then you return to the drug to get away from the shame, and it's just a um, self-reinforcing thing. I think the same thing is sex is like a drug, right? When it's promiscuous sex, right? It's not about relationship. It's not about intimacy. It's about, the feeling of sexual excitement and pleasure that you go back to as if it were a drug to escape from shame. But then the same cycle, you feel ashamed afterwards, and so you then revert to the same drug.
Yeah, it's definitely understandable. And then finally, on these shame experiences, and this one seems pretty obvious, but the way that you explained it was illuminating. So self-hatred and self-mockery, those are interesting, and you often bring up the context of like stand-up comedians who may make fun of themselves. I was wondering if you can kind of talk about that in the context of shame.
Right. So you had mentioned earlier that I talk about there's three strategies. One is avoiding shame, that's social anxiety. One is denying shame, which is narcissism, which I hope we'll talk a little bit about. And then denying shame, then controlling shame. I'm going to say it before you can say it. You can't shame me because I'm going to shame myself first. I think the worst experience is the unexpected shaming experience. When you aren't prepared for it, you're just out there enjoying yourself, you're relaxed, and then you do something foolish or something happens that exposes you to public ridicule. It's worse when you don't see it coming. So by controlling it, by getting there before anybody else can say it, by making the joke at my own expense, then at least I know it's happening, right? And I have control over when it happens, how intense it is, how strong it is, what's pointed out. Um, that it, I think that the sections on self-hatred might be counterintuitive and harder for people to understand, but it's really true that the uncontrolled experience that someone can inflict upon you without you seeing coming is way worse than hating yourself. It sounds weird, but it is.
Wow. Wow. Yeah. So it's a way of planning the shame in some way to know when it'll occur and how intense it'll be. So it's not this surprising, abrasive experience.
Right. And one of the cases I talk about in the book is a guy I worked with who hated himself as a way of stopping himself from ever becoming vulnerable. Like whenever there was a prospect of relationship um, with a woman, he would just go into a bout of self-hatred that would actually put him in bed. It was so horrible, but he would never risk actual shame, at the hands of someone else in a relationship by being vulnerable.
Yes, I do. I remember that case. Um, well, a moment ago you mentioned narcissism, and I think that that has to do with this idea of the idealized false self. Is that correct? And if so, can
Yeah.
you talk a little about that?
Yeah, I think that there are all sorts of ways of coping with shame that we all employ. That aren't pathological, that are normal. And I really do try and talk about the everyday ways of coping with shame. The pathological ones, narcissism is the big one, and it's where this sense of core shame is so unbearable and repressed, and an entirely false self is constructed to cover over the shame and to present to the world as, here's this perfect person, and don't you admire me? And I am none of those things that I feel underneath. Um, so that's the core defense in narcissism. It goes along with a set of other defenses that we all use all the time that are normal, but in a narcissist, they're characterological and persistent. So that's, blaming other people for our own shortcomings. We all do that from time to time. Contempt, arrogance. Um, I think your listeners will probably recognize people when they hear this descriptions, because what the narcissist usually does is he or she displaces this shame-ridden self that's denied, projects it onto other people, and then scorns, contemns, shames them to get rid of his or her own feelings. Um, pretty common defense mechanism in narcissists. I mean, I think
Right.
everybody's known people like that, right?
Right. Yeah. So yeah. Yeah. And you just mentioned it. It's that trying to deny, avoid, or control shame isn't always unhealthy. But if we use any of those tactics like pathologically, or it becomes like a crutch, then it can become unhealthy. If I'm saying that correctly. But I want to kind of turn to how dealing with shame, how facing it can actually help us grow both personally and as a society. So, so why is shame useful as an emotion? Like, let's just kind of get down to what's the utility of shame.
Well, first of all, in the global way, shame is useful for the human species in promoting tribal norms, so that we developed the capacity to experience shame because fear of shame causes us to subscribe to tribal values, increases our survival value, increases the survival value of the tribe. On a personal level, I think that shame often has something to teach us. Like there's a reason why we feel shame sometimes, and if we just defend against it, then we don't um, we don't learn anything. We just persist. We just keep on denying that we have anything to feel ashamed about. So there's examples throughout the book that often my personal examples of things that I felt ashamed about, ways I'd behaved, and that it was only when I could, accept that there was actually a good reason to feel ashamed, that shame was in fact the appropriate feeling. Not the global, I'm a totally bad person kind of shame, but the more discreet, yeah, I really misbehaved there. I owe someone an apology. Um, there's many occasions, and I think this is surprisingly rare. Um, I think about the very heartfelt apologies I've made in my life that involved a lot of soul searching and coming to grips with my own mistakes and character flaws so that I could grow enough, to grapple with them. And then I think about all the apologies that I'm really due and will never get. There's a lot
Mhm.
of people. I think it's very hard for people to admit they made a mistake so that they can learn from a feeling of shame. I think
Yeah.
it's rare.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. And I love the example you give of your own personal experience of when you're talking to a friend at dinner and kind of got into a debate about politics, and thing led to another, and you ended up apologizing. I thought it was a very interesting way that you described it. Maybe you can outline that story for people.
Yeah, these are close friends of ours, and we're still good friends. But the husband in this couple and I like to talk politics, and we can get heated about it. We mostly agree on things, so it's very good natured, and we don't mind a lively debate. His wife gets very agitated, and I knew this, and I was insensitive, and I really drove her away from the table. She was so upset by just being in the presence of this kind of conversation, which the husband and I easily could have done on our own some other time. So it's a minor example, but it was insensitive, and I apologized to her, and apology was accepted. I'd misbehaved.
Yeah, and that was despite your male friend saying, that he hadn't been offended by anything, but you felt that you had uh, crossed your own lines. You know, not lived up to your own values.
Right.
Right.
And you know, and as I said, driven his wife away from the table. That's not very good host-like behavior.
Yes. Yeah. I think we can all relate to an experience like that for sure.
Yeah.
Um, so you mentioned how shame is useful in a social context. Um, and early on in the book, you mention John Ronson's book, the "So You've Been Publicly Shamed," and that is kind of the precursor or sort of a prologue to the current times where some people call it cancel culture, some people just call it accountability. But what do you think of that current kind of movement that's, and maybe it's just on Twitter, but it seems to be on social media where it seems to me that there may be times when public shaming kind of spirals out of control. Would you agree with that? And what's your view of that?
You know, the whole thing about the history of shame and how societies have used it is, um, you know, shame expulsion from the social order was usually a temporary thing, and you were allowed to make amends, and then once you had learned your lesson, you were welcomed back into the tribe. You know, shaming as as an attempt to reform behavior, and it included forgiveness. The way shame works now is you are out and there's no chance of rehabilitation. You know, it's that's what canceling is it's like if you made a mistake, you're done and you can never reform and your life is over. I mean, that's the thing. I mean, and in some cases that does seem appropriate, like, you know, with, you know, sexual predators like Harvey Weinstein, you know, yeah, that pretty much is unforgivable. But there's a lot of other things that, you know, youthful indiscretions, the wrong word spoken at the wrong time, having an opinion when you were in your 20s that you changed later. I mean, are you really forever banished from the tribe for having made a mistake? I don't, that seems wrong to me.
Yeah. Yeah. And you're just talking about how it was once a way of temporarily pushing people out of society to sort of teach them a lesson, and then they would come back in. But, you know, and you're just saying that there's different bars for this, but if you had to come up with something, what should be the mechanism for allowing people back into society? Is it after they've apologized, like provided that their offense wasn't so extreme that we, you know, consider it unforgivable? Is that enough, or is this just too broad of a question?
No, I don't think it's too broad of a question. Well, first of all, apologies is never enough in cancel culture, you know, and a lot of people give the advice when you're canceled is don't ever apologize because it just makes them pile on even more. Um, but I think that there does need to be an apology of some kind. It needs to be sincere, which is hard to gauge, so it can't be just an apology. I think over time you have to see some evidence of true contrition and that people really have reformed. You know, it's kind of a ritual in Hollywood that, you know, you apologize, you go into detox for, you know, for some kind of addiction, and then you come out and you do public service. That's the right model, but that too can be faked. So I don't know. It just seems to me that the door has to be open, right? You have to allow people to prove that they are worthy of acceptance back into society. You can't forever banish them, um, except in, the most heinous cases.
Right, right. Well, I really appreciate that. And I wonder if you're all right with it. I would kind of like to zoom out to some bigger questions or broader questions, I guess, outside of shame and more. Some of these are a little bit philosophical. Some have to do with current events. And if you're all right with that, I'd like to jump into
Sure.
that.
Yeah.
So actually, I came across a really interesting article that you wrote in April 2020 about, it was titled "Why Liberals Should Oppose the Lockdown." And you were arguing that even if you agree with authoritarian actions by governments, you should oppose them. And I particularly loved your quote there. I just wanted to read this that you said, we must cling to our defense of civil liberties and not defer to a vast expansion of government authority in the name of saving lives. So I know this is totally kind of off the topic of shame and everything, but I think it's still relevant now. And I'm wondering if you can explain your rationale in that article and maybe what your knowledge of human psychology, how that maybe played into this or how you think about those things.
Well, you may think you've departed from shame, but you haven't really. It's right on topic. Um, I always say I'm of a libertarian bent, and I always say to my friends of either party, I said, you should believe in limited government because your party is not always going to be in. And then you have to accept that the power you've accorded government when your team was in can now be used by, the other team. That's to me the biggest argument for being a libertarian. And this big expansion of government power now that has really been supported by the left um, is scary. And I don't think that people on the left have properly appreciated that those powers that are now accorded to the government can be used by the other side, right? So if like one of the arguments I make is like, well, if I decide that if the government decides that you have to stay at home and and you have to be vaccinated and wear a mask because it's endangering the life of somebody else, I mean, why can't why can't the Supreme Court come in and say, you know, you can't have a right to choose because you're endangering the life of an unborn fetus. I mean, I- and we're about to see that happen, right? So I just think that the vast expansion of power and the willingness of people to be told what to do by their government and suspend critical thought was really upsetting to me over the last couple of years. And the way it was done was with shame. It was done with
Mhm.
shame and fear. So there was a big propaganda machine going on, constantly trumpeting the dangers and the figures and the expansions and the deaths and making everyone terrified. Laura Dodsworth wrote a really good book called The State of Fear about how that
Hmm.
happened, how governments used fear to enforce conformity and to get people to do what they were told.
Hmm.
Um, and then I think the other thing is like shame. I mean, shaming people who were um, skeptical, shaming people who thought, well, do masks really work? Shaming people who were skeptical about the value of vaccines. Were they really were they really safe? Were they tested thoroughly? Um, I mean, I spent 2 years really keeping my mouth shut because virtually everybody I know had a different opinion from mine, and I listened to them express contempt for people who thought the way I did. And they're, kind of like those people are, they're the great unwashed. They're stupid Trump supporters. They, it was horrible. There was no room for any kind of dissent. And I'm really worried about this now. I'm worried about the creation of this new, disinformation bureau within the Department of Defense.
Yeah.
Terrifying idea to me.
Hmm.
That, that some government agency is going to decide what's disinformation. Well, you look at Joe Rogan,
Yeah.
and one of the things he said was all of these things that are now turning out to be true, like the Wuhan lab theory, um, the efficacy of vaccines, whether or not they really stopped transmission, and on and on. He said those were cancelable offenses a year ago. You could get dropped from Twitter, you could be banned from YouTube. Um, I don't know. It's like, but it was this enforced consensus, like this is what the science had decided, and anybody who didn't agree was, a troglodyte and had to be banished. I mean that's shame, and it's a pretty insidious kind of shame.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. Actually, I also have kind of a libertarian bent. Um, Yeah, that's all I think completely true. And I was just listening to an interview with Dr. Jay Bhattacharya. I think I'm pronouncing that right.
Yeah.
But about he was one of the authors of the Great Barrington Declaration, which was
Yeah.
about essentially questioning a lot of the things that had been established as the science by people like Francis Collins and Anthony Fauci. And the reason I'm mentioning it is because I think your point about shame is on point. And even at the highest levels, there was a sort of smear campaign against people like Bhattacharya and the other authors of that article to sort of shame them into submission, or at least create the illusion that they should be shamed for pushing, what was considered by the sort of establishment as junk science, but is now being seen as credible and good science.
Totally. Jay Bhattacharya is a hero of mine, and the other two authors, Martin Kulldorff and Sunendra Gupta, I signed on to that declaration when it
Mm,
came out, and I followed them from the very beginning, including and other epidemiologists and virologists who had a dissenting point of view, but had been kind of locked out, because they dissented. It was horrible. It was a horrible thing, especially since, as you know, what the Great Barrington Declaration was advocating for had been accepted pandemic apology up through 2019. It was accepted science that that was the way they were going to deal with it. And then everything changed, and they were just trying to uphold what we all knew was true pre-COVID, and yet they were shamed and banished from the scientific community. I mean, it was awful.
yeah, absolutely. Well, I'd love to keep talking about this, but I do have some other very different questions that we can go into if that's all right. So this well, actually, first I want to back up and ask you a little bit of biographical information, because you were talking about how this book is kind of a personal project for you, and how there's a lot of your own personal experiences in this. And I wonder if you could kind of just talk about where you maybe where you grew up, or what your academic background is, and how you came to be a therapist, how you came to study shame, and just how all that fits into this book and your thinking in general.
Oh boy.
Yeah, it's an easy question. So,
Yeah, you want my life story.
exactly.
Um, I'll make it as short and succinct as I can. So I grew up in Los Angeles, um, and by the time I reached my teen years, I was pretty severely depressed, mildly suicidal, struggling with my sexuality. And I went into therapy at that time and stayed in therapy with the same therapist for 13 years, and he saved my life. Um, And also, I think, which is a frequent route to becoming a therapist, is that midway through, I realized that I wanted to become a therapist and recoup some of this money I had spent on, on therapy over the years. Um, it's a surprisingly common story is about how many people come to therapy that way. So I was trained as a psychoanalyst. I mean, I had a counseling license. I have a clinical psychology license, but I'm also a graduate psychoanalyst, which means that I went through, apart from the seminars, I went through a personal analysis 4 times a week for years. And that's where you learn how to practice therapy. So I consider my personal therapy to have been really successful. It's where I learned how to be a therapist. My therapist was a really good therapist, except for having some kind of um, doctrinaire ideas about homosexuality.
Mm,
So he sort of supported my wish to not be a gay man. So I married, and I had a ostensibly heterosexual life, and I have 3 children, and I don't regret any of it. But it was part of my idealized false self.
mm,
I was normal, right? And not only was I normal, I kind of had this enviable life. Two professionals, yuppie couple on the west side of Los Angeles. We were doing well. We had a nice house. We had beautiful children. And then my marriage fell apart, and I came out, and I was just sort of overcome with shame. And I had to kind of dig my way out of it. And a good friend of mine who was also an analyst began talking to me about shame and her understanding of it, and it just really hit home. So, out of my personal growth, I then started applying all of those ideas to my clients, some of whom had been with me for a long time, and we were kind of stuck, like we weren't making progress, and it was because I didn't understand shame.
Hmm.
And I'm always grateful to those patients who stayed with me long enough for me to learn what I needed to learn to help them. Um, so then I started putting it to work in my practice, and then I started writing about it and researching it. And since it's the clinically and personally the most important issue for me, that I've kind of spent the last 20 years, you know, thinking, writing about it.
Yeah. Wow. That's a fascinating story. I must say the book is wonderfully written. It's very vivid and just very good writing. And I know that you're also a fiction writer too. And wondering if you can talk, if does that inform or supplement your work as a therapist at all?
For sure. I mean, all of my therapeutic ideas, all my ideas about psychology, of course, inform my characters. So I wrote a collection of three fairy tale retellings. It's Cinderella, Snow White, and Rapunzel, and they're each like novella length, and they're all about shame, right? They're all about shame and defenses against shame. Um, so like Cinderella starts with her the sentence something to the effect that she had always felt like she belonged in the ashes, that she was just incredibly shame-ridden, and then it goes from there. The one of the huntsmen in the Snow White story is a closeted gay man riddled with shame, and the 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 wicked stepmother is a total narcissist
Mm.
defending against shame, kind of more of a personality, like a more of like a antisocial personality disorder type. And then the third fairy tale was about borderline. So it's really all about how shame informs certain kind of mental illness, borderline person. I think shame is really implicated in all of the personality disorders.
Hmm.
And kind of, I don't know, I think it's all about shame, right? It all comes down to shame ultimately for me.
Ah, okay, I get you. Yeah. Wow. Well, now, the last few questions I have are really broad, but so I kind of subject all my guests to answering this very simple, easy question of how the brain works if they're a neuroscientist. But I'm interested in asking you, what's your view of how the mind works, or how does it develop, if that's something you think about?
I do think about it. I'm not a neuroscientist, so I can't really speak at that level of understanding, but I do think that I reference those MRI studies that talk about brain development. I do think that um, the brain develops in accordance with environmental stimuli, and that it can be deformed, deficient, defective based on really bad environments. And I think that I know neuroplasticity is the big thing. I know that's true to some extent, but I think it has limits. And I don't think that neuroplasticity means that you can take someone who had a brutal, toxic childhood and make them as if they were like someone who came from a happy family. I don't think that. I think there are limits. I do believe in damage that is you can't recover from. I think but I don't, that sounds more pessimistic than I feel. To me, it's more like, yeah, I have these limitations and I just have to take them into account. when I'm planning what I can't expect myself to be unaffected by my past. I have to take it into account. It's affected the way my brain works, and there's only so much I can do about that.
Mhm. Right. More about improvement rather than some kind of perfection that can't be attained.
Right, exactly.
Right. Um,
One other thing I would say is
yeah.
that I talk a lot about, neural pathways being etched. I think about that a lot in terms of habits, and it's like falling falling into the rut, and that will always be the default position unless you exert energy to get out of the rut, out of the neural pathway, and to then etch and form and etch new pathways. I think that way a lot about forming positive habit formation and why it's so hard to change.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's the sort of the work of therapy and of just changing ourselves in general, is that that's what the hard part is changing those pathways in our brains.
Right. And I always say that, insight, the aha moments, that's the easy part.
Mm-hmm.
And then you have to put it to work, which requires a lot of effort going against the grain, going against all your inclinations. It's not easy to change.
Right. Yeah, definitely. So if you had to recommend somebody read just one book about whether it's a broad topic like psychology or perhaps it's on therapy, but if there was just one book that somebody had to read in kind of that realm, what would you recommend? And you can recommend your own book if you'd like.
No, I'm not that much of a narcissist. I will recommend the book that has affected me most that I've read in the past 10 years, and that's *Sapiens*
Mm,
by Yuval Harari. The
hmm.
most disturbing look at human nature. But it's kind of brutally honest about what human beings are really like. A lot of this stuff in evolutionary biology is, I think, profound, and people need to understand that. They need to read it.
Yeah.
Um,
Why do you think that's relevant, evolutionary biology, for kind of our current times?
because I think people like to pretend that, well, it's the whole blank slate hypothesis of human nature, which I do not subscribe to. The unconstrained vision, and
Yes.
Thomas Sowell talks about. I think there's this wish to believe that we can just invent human nature as we would like it to be, and it's all malleable. It's all depends on social influence, and I think an understanding about how evolution shaped us and what the you know what's in our genes that we really can't avoid, how hormones work, for
Hmm.
example. I mean, I just think, you know stop pretending that, human nature is better than it is or different from what it is, right?
Right. All right. Well, that's interesting. You just mentioned two of my strongest recommendations, which are The Blank Slate by Steven Pinker and A Conflict of Visions by Thomas Sowell. There you go. Nice.
uh, right here in front of me, and
Oh,
I have them
excellent.
both. I have
Oh,
them both right here.
oh,
Here's
that's
another one. I don't know if you know this book. Do you know this book?
it's kind of blending in demonic males. It's
Demonic
like
Males.
there. I haven't. Who's that by?
It's by Richard Wrangham.
Oh,
I think he's at Harvard, and he's an evolutionary biologist, and it's just about what men are like all over the world, and what's in there and why it's there. It's troubling.
yeah. Well, that sounds fascinating. I'll put that on my list for sure. It's looked probably you have a great stack of books over there. It seems like.
Well, these happen to be the three that I was reading recently because I've just finished teaching a course with a friend of mine, and the blank slate was one of the things I was talking about, and the Thomas Sowell book about the constrained versus the unconstrained visions.
Yeah, those are just fascinating books, and if anybody hasn't come across them yet, I mean, those are two of my favorite writers out there too. So definitely check those out, and I will get that Demonic Males on my list. Um, and the one that you recommended at first that I'm now blanking on, which is
Sapiens.
Sapiens. I've read that as well. Yes,
Yeah.
but that is a good one. Um, So, I mentioned, that the writing in the book is just superb, and I'm wondering if you have any kind of general lessons for, a science communicator like me, about communicating psychology and these kind of complex topics to a general audience.
I think that if you're communicating psychology properly to people, it should be intuitively, obviously true to them. Because I think all we're doing is talking about common sense things, right? Things that people will say, oh, yeah, of course. I hadn't really thought about it that way, but yeah. I think it should be easily accessible. It shouldn't require a lot of specialized vocabulary or knowledge. It's just human nature, what we all know.
Well, that definitely comes through in shame. Um, Thank you so much for talking to me today, Joe. It's been really fascinating, and I really enjoyed the conversation.
Me too. Thanks a lot for inviting me.
Absolutely. All right, well, that's it. Thank you so much for listening or watching this episode of the Sense of Mind podcast. Please be sure to like and subscribe to the YouTube channel as well as the podcast. And also consider giving this show a 5-star rating on whatever podcast platform you use. As always, this channel is brought to you by the Diamond Mind Foundation. This episode was written and produced by me, Andrew Cooper Sansone. Thank you so much for watching. I'll catch you next time.